Welcome, everyone. I'm Suzanne Canary, Marketing Manager at AUC Press, and thank you for joining us today for our virtual book talk for Recycling for Death, newly published by AUC Press this month, October 2024. The book is available worldwide, with the exception of Egypt, is about to be delivered, hopefully very soon. So unfortunately, I don't have a book to show you, as I usually do. Yeah, Kara, you have a copy there. Exactly.
I have it.
Yeah, exactly. That's the heavy
Yeah.
lifting book. Exactly.
Yeah.
So our event today is going to be around an hour. I'm going to have room for Q&A at the end. So please, if you have any questions and you're joining on Zoom, please type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen so we don't miss them. And if you're joining on our Facebook Live on the AUC Press page, please type the question in the comment section and we're going to ask them on your behalf. Our book today, Recycling for Death, Coffin Reuse in Ancient Egypt and the Theban Royal Caches, is a meticulous study of social, economic, and religious significance of coffin reuse and the development during the Ramesside and early Third Intermediate periods. It's a culmination of 15 years of coffin study that analyzes coffins and other funerary equipment of elites from the 19th to the 22nd dynasties to provide essential windows into social strategies and adaptations employed during the Bronze Age collapse and subsequent Iron Age reconsolidation. The book is illustrated throughout with high-quality images, and the line drawings and color, black and white photographs are also ideal for careful study, especially on the digital edition where you can actually zoom in. The book is available for sale worldwide through major bookstores and online book retailers, and soon in Egypt through AUC bookstores and other booksellers. And I'll be sharing links in the chat box and on Facebook and in Zoom if you want to order your copy. And we're so delighted today to have with us the expert on coffin reuse, Kara Cooney, who is professor of Egyptology and chair of the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures at UCLA. Specializing in social history, gender studies, and economies in the ancient world, she received her PhD in Egyptology from Johns Hopkins University. And in 2005, she was the co-curator of the Tutankhamun and the Golden Age of the Pharaohs at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. Her popular books include The Woman Who Would Be King, Hatshepsut's Rise to Power in Ancient Egypt, and When Women Ruled the World, Six Queens of Egypt, and The Good King's Absolute Power in Ancient Egypt and the Modern World. Her latest academic book is Ancient Egyptian Society, Challenging Assumptions and Exploring Approaches. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming our esteemed author, Kara Cooney. Now over to you, Kara.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you, everyone. Yes, it is a weapon. Somebody made a comment in the chat. It's very heavy, and I'm just so relieved that it's out. So please, get a copy if you can. If you can't, I understand $125 is a lot of money for many people, for most people. But it's a subsidized price. And I'm grateful to UCLA, to the Coates Institute, to Global Antiquity, to the Humanities Division for getting me a book subvention that allowed me to get that price down to $125. So it seems really expensive, but it could have been worse. It could have been a lot worse. So we'll take that with that grain of salt. So as we jump into all of this, I want to thank the women who helped me with this book more than anything, and that would be Kylie Thompson, who laid it out and designed it, Amber Myers-Wells, who helped with everything, reading the text and bibliography. I want to thank Miriam Fahmy, who when I approached her and told her there would be 1,000 images in it, and her eyes widened as big as saucers, she didn't tell me to just go away. And I'd like to thank Sarah Hassan in the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir for helping me with 2 seasons of research. And without her, without all of these women, none of this would have been possible. So we'll start with that and then move through the material. And let's see if I can make it to 45 minutes, but I have all kinds of pictures of coffins at the end, and we can just skip them because we can't talk about everything, and the book exists for a reason. So I'd like to explain that this book is a study of the Bronze Age collapse through material culture. It's that simple. It's a study of a human crisis by looking at a particular set of objects. Coffins can tell you a massive amount about people because they represent an individual, and reused coffins can tell you that there are multiple people trying to use these coffins, but they're also statements of power and statements of power that are displayed. So we'll get into the intricacies of these, but by looking at these 64 coffins, I'm able to do a discussion of power during the Bronze Age collapse, which is the focus of the talk today. So we have the New Kingdom, a time period of extraordinary prosperity and growth. And by Dynasty 20, we see a kind of diminishing return set in, a decadence, if you will, power that cannot sustain itself, and you have this collapse. There are outside influences, there are inside influences. This is not where I'm going to discuss what I'm going to discuss today, but I'm really going to keep it Theban centric and look at the adaptations to this collapse from the South. Now, this is our, and sorry about the scrolling, but we will make it work. It's a complicated topic. We're not going to spend too much time on this, but we have drought and climate change. We have people sleeping through the Mediterranean. We have kingdoms falling left and right, and we have sea peoples coming in to Egypt in concert with the Libyans, who may be an earlier form of sea peoples. One can discuss. I discuss this with Jason Silvestri all the time. So we have an image here of Ramses III fighting the sea peoples at Medinet Habu Temple, and the Egyptians are telling us themselves that there is great upheaval and discord. There are social changes. There are things going on that cannot be controlled, and they're working with this. They're dealing with this and trying to understand how to survive in this difficult world. As these cataclysmic and large social shifts happen, you see shifts in power. And a decentralization is happening throughout Egypt. You have here an image from Karnak Temple, which shows the high priest of Amen, Amenhotep, shown at the same scale and same size, almost, as Ramses IX, the king of the north. And if you look at the image, the high priest of Amen really takes your eye. It becomes the focal point because of the unusual posture of his arms, because of the other priests that are helping him with his robe. And the king looks very staid and traditional. So the attention is supposed to go to the high priest. And by the end of the 20th dynasty, Thebes was able to survive by relying on institutions that could work without kingship, in the absence of a strong kingship. And so we see a survival of elites, new elites and old elites in the Theban region that is different from what you see in Memphis or Heliopolis or the Delta to the north, where you see much more destabilized social situations. And all of this is going to affect resources. And the resources that I'm going to be looking at the most will be trees, wood, right? There's all kinds of resources that rich people need, and Egyptologists focus on these things all the time. We talk about hard stones, we talk about Tura limestone, we talk about gold, we talk about precious stones like carnelian or turquoise. Wood for ancient Egyptians and still for modern Egyptians is a scarce resource. It is hard to get your hands on. And with these cataclysmic events happening at the late Bronze Age, wood was trees, stands of trees were something that must have been destroyed and or marshaled into other purposes. And though we don't have any direct information about stands of trees in the Delta, there is information that in the Ptolemaic period, in the Greco-Roman period of Egypt, that the Delta did sustain large stands of local woods like sycamore fig or acacia wood, things like that could be grown in a delta large stand of trees. And these really must have been burned and or needed to be used for weapons. And without wood, you can't make coffins. And so we have a situation in which coffin making needs to rely on reuse of older wooden objects. On the left, you've got a sycamore fig. On the right, you've got a cedar tree of Lebanon. And I think that's actually a tree from Highclere Castle. So it is not from the Lebanon. But that cedar tree, I mean, if we can't get the sycamore fig, we're not going to be able to get the cedar imported from the Lebanon because so much of that trade is shut down. But it's an thing that wood is one of the most scarce commodities, even while things like paints and varnishes seem to last. So the one thing that drives coffin reuse and drives this need to display is a need to socially differentiate yourself from other people. So if you're a wealthy elite and you want to make sure that everyone in your community, your Theban community, perhaps, since that's what we're focusing on, knows that you're a wealthy elite, then the funeral is the best way for a family to socially differentiate themselves, to say, our bodies are different from your bodies. Our bodies will not decay while yours will. And we will be buried in a nesting set of coffins that will protect us like a magical force field. And this need to acquire these coffins and to display them in a social context was so great that we see the ancient Egyptians engaging in a systematized reuse. But for those of you interested in coffin display, human competition, keeping up with the Joneses, as we say in the United States, do look at my book, Coffin Commerce, with the Cambridge Element series, where I go through a lot of that there and even compare, as I did in The Cost of Death, the Egyptian funeral to the American wedding, trying to understand how people use objects to set themselves apart in a society and to manufacture social power. This coffin on the right, this detail, is from a Babel Gazus coffin that I observed with Stefania Mainieri in the Cairo Museum at Tahrir. And it's just wonderful to see how a coffin could be displayed on men's shoulders with all of the priests and the magical rituals that were done alongside. It would have been an event when an elite man or woman died and they were interred into their tomb. Now, if coffin reuse is going to become de rigueur because it's something that needs to be done for the elites to maintain and manufacture their power, then we see people, certainly in the Theban region, looking to where they can get coffin wood. That's what I'm looking at. But the tomb robbery papyri, this is a much broader set of documents about what people are looking for, because the necropolises of the Western deserts in Thebes, they preserve a huge amount of wealth at a time period of great social upheaval. People are going to do what people need to do to survive. So when things are difficult, you can't get wood, you can't get certain resources, you would look to the necropolis and look for places where the ancestors had buried these things for hundreds of years. Indeed, many of these things, most of this reuse will be happening in a legal context, according to family members going into their own tomb chambers, their burial chambers, and reusing what they saw was fit to reuse. They're not going to write this down. This isn't the kind of thing that you commit to writing in a diary or something like that. The only time when you have things written down is when there's a contestation, when there's some sort of disagreement. And so the tomb robbery papyri are helpful for us to understand that people in high-level elites, the high priest of Amun, the vizier, the king's men and all of his butlers, all of these people descend upon Thebes, certainly by the reign of Ramses IX, if not a little before and certainly after. And they're trying to sort out amongst each other who's doing this tomb robbery, who's in control. You can read these tomb robbery papyri as documentations of rooting out poorer elements and people who are responsible for this theft. But you can also, and this is how I read them, as documents in which elites are competing with other elites over these resources and are interrogating and torturing men, saying, did you go into this tomb? Did you go into that tomb? But do remember that every man who is being interrogated and tortured in these texts has a minder, has a patron, has somebody whom he is working for. So there is a much larger story of elite competition going on in the 20th dynasty in terms of control of the resources coming out of Western Thebes. And I'm not the first to have talked about this. Look at the work of Nicholas Reeves, Carl Janssen Winkel, John Taylor. There's Nigel Strudwick. There's so many people who have discussed this kind of re-commodification of elements in the Valley of the Kings. Now, I put Tutankhamun here because he's the one who was not discovered or reused, recommodified in the 20th and 21st dynasties. And we have to imagine then, if this is perhaps a less rich tomb compared to what Ramses II and Amenhotep III would have had. This is what I think. I know there's disagreement here. We won't know. It's gone. So we can't, no one can prove anything. But if what we have in Tutankhamun is a case in point for the kinds of riches that would have been stored in this place, this was a literal gold mine. This was a place where people could go when trade routes were shut down, when quarries and gold mines were also shut down. And this seems to be what the people in power did do with the Western Theban space and with the royal as well as private spaces. And so you get all kinds of documentation, which I do follow in the book Recycling for Death. The second chapter is the longest in the book in terms of text, and it goes through all of the textual elements, many of which are well known, like these dockets or late Ramesside letters or disputes from Deir el-Medina. But I go through them from a different perspective. The perspective of the late Bronze collapse, the perspective of social upheaval, and the perspective of recycling and recommodification. Because people are not going to write down and say, oh, we stripped this coffin of Seti the First today and took all of this stuff and then, stripped this other coffin and put the king in here. They're not going to say that kind of thing. Every element of power is meant to be veiled. Every element of power is meant to be religiously and ideologically cloaked. So instead, we get a docket like this, written on the coffin in which Seti the First was reburied. Regnal year 6, month 2 of inundation, day 7, nice precise date, nice bureaucracy. The day when the vizier, the general, and the high priest of Amun-Re, king of the gods Herihor, issued a dispatch to restore the burial of King Menmot-Re, life, prosperity, and health, the son of Re, Seti, beloved of Ptah, by the agent Hera-Men-Penaf, and the cadet, and we can discuss the titles, we don't need to, Pre Paiute. And this is a translation from Rittner's Libyan Anarchy. You can go check it out there. But we don't get exactly what they're doing. So you have to take this in combination with the coffin that has inlaid eyes, does have elements of gilding still attached to it, was cut down from something much larger, was reshaped and modified after it was stripped of its wealth. You use that in combination with the textual information, and you're able to build a holistic argument for the kinds of source collection, income creation that people in power are creating for themselves, and who's doing it, and how they're being named, and how responsibility is given to certain people in this time of great social upheaval. And I find it so interesting that we can connect this, which I do, with this law of the pharaoh that we have from Deir el-Medina, published for the first time in this seminal article by Janssen and Pesman, Burial Inheritance in the Community of the Necropolis Workmen at Thebes. And they talk about a dispute in which it is claimed that the one who buries inherits from the person they have buried, which implies that this display of caretaking of the ancestor is required for you to inherit their power. And this is the fulcrum of everything. This is where it all happens. So that if you have people like Herihor and before him, Pai Ankh, these generals who become high priests in a decentralized 20th dynasty into the 21st dynasty Egypt, then you have them going in and creating income from the Valley of the Kings and maybe from elite necropolises as well. And when they do so in a careful way in which what they're taking is obfuscated. Everything that they're doing is religiously cloaked. And also at the same time, they set themselves up as the caretakers of these kings. You saw on the docket, he is reburying, he is reconsecrating, he is re-Osirifying this king Seti the First, and a new docket is written, and he is there saying, I'm the one who buries. Thus, he is the one who inherits the power as well. And this is a key for how this entire period is working. It is a quid pro quo. It is a give and take. I will take care of the ancestors while taking their goods at the same time. Okay, fine, but you have to survive. And then they will take care of me. We see these kinds of give and take scenarios depicted in temples of the time. Here we have Khonsu Temple and Herihor, who is really only named king here. We don't have his coffin, alas. I wish we did, and I don't think we'll ever find it. I think it's gone. But Herihor, who was responsible for so much of the recommodification as an agent and then as a leader in the Valley of the Kings, he depicts himself as king in Khonsu Temple. And he's the one who's able to recommodify. He's able to receive the kingship, at least in this context, at least in this place. But it's more complicated. His kingship and Penejim the First kingship, that's a different talk. So we'll skip this and move along with how the recommodification was able to make generals into high priests, into kings. The kingship is a liminal situation, but Penejim the First, the next king in the lineage, the next high priest in the lineage, also plays with this idea of kingship at the same time that he's recommodifying the burials from the Valley of the Kings. And again, that's from a different talk, so we'll move along and keep it moving. It is an interesting thing that all of this is happening at a time period when ad hoc decision making, the vizier saying we'll do this or we'll do that, is diminished in favor of a more collective style of decision making. And the oracle is one element of that. And you do actually see reuse sorted through oracular pronouncements in which men are going to a particular oracle, in one case a moot oracle, and saying, can we reosirify and move this king? Yes, you can. This is a different text, but it's interesting to see that we have a group of elites in Thebes who are corporatively sharing power and working through the religious oracle to shift responsibility from any one person and to distribute it amongst themselves in a broader capacity. And this brings us to the book, Recycling for Death, and how this is a study of Bronze Age collapse through an examination of all of these different coffins, because we're looking at the coffins in which the kings were reburied, the single and reused coffins and strict coffins in which the kings were buried, in addition to all of the coffins that the high priests reused and redecorated for themselves. So it's an interesting collection of material documents. And when you put that together with the textual documents, it tells a very interesting story of adaptation, survival, and income creation. Just to give you, there's more coffins to come, but here we have the coffin of Penejim the First, who was a high priest of Amun and then did call himself king in some cases. This is a wonderful document to illustrate what I'm talking about, that the one who caretakes inherits, and yet how complicated it is in terms of taking from those ancestors at the same time. This is a problematic quid pro quo that we're talking about, because this coffin that Penejim the First has himself buried in is reused from King Thutmose the First, and you can see the name in the cartouche plastered over underneath the redecoration that was done for Penejim the First. And on this coffin, Penejim the First does indeed call himself king. We have to assume that he commissioned it during his lifetime. We have to assume that he had access to this coffin material through his recommodification of the Valley of the Kings. So, and then notice that Penejim the First coffin is also recommodified. There is removal of gilding from his face and body. So no one is safe in this time period of income scarcity and problematic upheavals, social upheavals. Some kings are more important than others, and I have more information about this towards the end. But it is an interesting thing that we have some kings in the royal cache with the high priests of Amun, like Amenhotep I, and kings from the beginnings of dynasties, particularly the beginnings of the 18th dynasty or even the 17th dynasty, Second Enrei Tal, will be discussed. And you have less kings from what we might call the decadent endings of dynasties. Certainly the Egyptians perceived it that way. They did not include in their Dir al-Bahri 320 or TT 320 cache kings like Amenhotep III, who is from the end of the 18th dynasty, let alone Akhenaten and other rulers from the end of the 18th dynasty. And they also didn't include kings from the end of the 19th dynasty and 20th dynasty. Ramses IX is an exception. And I talk about that in the book. There are possible theories there. But note on the coffin of Amenhotep I, you can see that it's not a royal coffin in the last slide. And you can see that if it was a high elite's coffin, let's assume that it was, if it wasn't royal, then it was stripped of gold sheeting almost certainly. And you can see the chisel marks, and you can see the name and the ritual text inscribed for Amenhotep I over the chisel marks. And this is the kind of work that I do in the book. This is the kind of close looking, and let me zoom in on this. And this is what you'll be able to do in the ebook. It's why I love the ebook as an option. And it may seem ridiculous to pay this much for a PDF, but if you have high quality images like that and you're able to zoom in, it's like gold in your hands, because you're able to see things that you would not be able to otherwise. But you can see here a chisel strike across the wood, and then you can see the text goes into the grooves of that chisel strike. This is from my notes as I'm in. You can see my little arrow. I've drawn it quickly with my finger, but we've included this kind of annotation in the book so that you get an understanding of what it is that I'm seeing. And not just showing a picture with a caption. If there's something I really want to point out, we will use arrows and point it out in the book. Ahmes Nefertari is included in Theban Tomb 320. Other kings are not. Now, it's an interesting thing to note that Amenhotep I and Ahmes Nefertari, these Theban rulers who are venerated and considered so important at this time period of Bronze Age collapse, are repurposed almost talismanically as those ancestors who are giving the power, shifting that power to a new generation of rulers. That you're caretaking their burials, you're putting them in coffins, you're reocerifying them. They are then in turn giving you the rule over Thebes. And many other men who are agents of these high priests and kings considered Amenhotep I, Thutmose III, these early 18th dynasty kings in the same way. And so here you have the coffin of Butek Amen, a line drawing. This coffin is now in the Museo Egizio in Torino. And you can see Butek Amen in a cult offering to Amenhotep I and worshiping Amenhotep I and Ahmes Nefertari. And you get an idea that there is this give and take between king and an agent, in a sense. We know that you've given to us, we will give back to you, and you will give rule and influence to us. It's an interesting way of going about all of this. And in tombs of the 20th dynasty, you do see influential necropolis workers. This is a Deir el-Medina tomb, standing in front of a host of royal ancestors, as if they know where they're all buried. These are men who know where the bodies are buried, literally. And that is why the late Ramesside letters make it very clear that as the discord descends onto the Theban region and as income creation desperately is needed, you have men from the necropolis who are put to work finding tombs that haven't been opened yet, sourcing where people are buried, where riches might be held. And I wonder if an image like this is somehow cleansing ritual act to show we know that you have given your riches to us and we will give back to you in return. In Karahawa is a little earlier in the 20th dynasty, and I know a lot of Egyptologists are like, no, Kara, this is too early. And I just want to put this out there that maybe this recommodification work started before Ramses IX. When we have the tomb robbery papyri, that there was perhaps something else going on here with the necropolis workers. Even while tombs were being built, other tombs could easily have been recommodified in this time period of social upheaval. Again, some of this we'll never know, but I'm going to put it out there nonetheless as a possibility, because it is the first time you see this in a private context with necropolis workers. The image of Thutmose III seems to be They're for very, very high elites. And I would argue that it is a part of Tutmosis III's body and re-coffin body being used talismanically as a giver of power to the new leaders of the Theban region. So when you see somebody on a coffin worshiping the re-Osirified or just Osirified Tutmosis III, I would argue that this very much has to do with using Tutmosis III as that talismanic justification for the power of these high priests of Amun, talismanic justification for the power of these, some of these men naming themselves as king. Okay, so now let's get to Dir al-Bahri 320, also called Theban Tomb 320. I won't focus as much on the tomb of Amenhotep II in the Valley of the Kings, so that those coffins are also in this book. So you can compare the other royal caches. And I even am able to include Kamoza in this book, who is not from either of these two royal caches, but was found singly on his own. But you're able to then see that Kamoza was also reburied, but then not cached. And it's an interesting discussion as to why. It's a reuse of an 18th dynasty tomb, maybe an 18th dynasty queen's tomb in the cliffs above Mentuhotep II's mortuary temple and tomb. And you can see how this works up to the right and up to the left of the tomb spaces. Now, all of these coffins were removed, put in the Egyptian Museum Cairo at Tahrir. Many of them have since been moved to the Nemek, the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization, and one can visit these coffins there. Most of the high priests and their wives, daughters, and sisters are still in the Egyptian Museum in Tahrir. Most of the royal coffins have been moved to the Nemek. So keep that in mind as you visit these places. Now, I just want to show this to give you an idea that when we work in the Egyptian Museum Cairo, we have a very limited amount of time. Our curatorial staff has a limited amount of time. They're helping a bazillion other people. When we get a coffin out, we're able to look at it for hours, and we do as much as we can in the shortest amount of time that we can. And I brought with me in 2016, 2018, and 2019, a team of UCLA graduate students and other team members to photograph and document while I'm looking and examining the coffin for reuse, doing the close examination that I do. Mistakes will be made, establishing shots will be missed. Sometimes they're impossible because we can't get them in the space that is allotted to us. And which means that this book is a research project that is not as thorough and complete as we would like. I include Darcy's black and white images for establishing shots because he was able to stand them up to the beautiful glass plate negative that I can't do with the equipment that I have, the time I'm allotted. I'm not a museum curator. I'm just doing. So this is very much a study of micro analysis of these coffins. But that's the kind of imagery you don't usually get when coffins are published. You'll get a nice image of the outside. You'll get maybe an image of the coffin size, and then halas, that's it. When I open a coffin and I'm able to see the inside of a piece that was not displayed in a funeral, was not there for human eyes to easily see, that's when I can see recommodification, reuse, use of plaster, cutting back of wood most easily. And yeah, so we'll keep that in mind. I use this as a template. I know many of you are doing research now out in the field, in museums and other ways. And it is good to at least keep some sort of template to allow some standardization and rigor as you're going through objects in a collection or objects on site. It's not always possible to get everything that you want, but this is how I worked with the material. Now, let's go through some of the coffins in the time that I have left, and I'll try to stop at 9:45, so we don't have a huge amount of time. But I want to leave it open for questions, and then I'll go back and forth between different slides and maybe move when you ask questions. But the coffin of Seqenen Tao is in which, and I have to be clear, the coffin in which Seqenen Tao was reburied was made for a king. Whether it was made for second Henry Tao originally is an arguable thing. We actually will never know, because this coffin, as you can see right here, has been stripped of most of its gilding. If it was regilded, and I do suggest it was regilded after gold sheeting was stripped from it, that gilding was very, very thin. But there was an attempt by the men who are resourcing this golden material to actually then caretake after the event of stripping the coffin. So it's such an interesting thing. They're taking gold sheeting and then they're regilding it. So they're showing themselves as the caretakers, even while they're taking all of these treasures from the kings at the same time. And the details that you're able to see can be rather astonishing, that inlaid eyes have been removed, and yet you see them painting, and gold sheeting has been removed, but we have a layer of plaster put on, this thick yellow paint, and even though the eyes have been removed, we're painting a nice blue paint around this face. There were probably multiple iterations of reuse. This reuse of these kings' coffins happened over generations, and you can track that as well, that the way a king was treated in Harry Horse time, in the end of the 20th dynasty, was different from the way a king was treated in Penejim's time, which was different from the way a king was treated in Penejim II's time. There seemed to have been interest in maintaining multiple layers of protection in Harry Horse time, keeping more gilding on a particular piece, and then they'll bury it or inter it in some way. And then there's a cultural memory that there's material there. Pull the piece out and take objects and material again, but still try to re-gild it, maybe with a thinner gilding this time, and then reinter it and then take it out again. And you're like, well, how do you know they're taking these pieces in and out? I'll show you in one moment. Notice the multiple layers. There is a blue underneath this yellow. So much more work needs to be done on these coffins. This is just my initial assessment of visual analysis. Now that this material is out there and photographed, I do hope that people are able to go out there with other technology and are able to solve, what is this blue underneath this yellow? Please do tell us all. Inquiring minds want to know. And what is underneath this coffin? Maybe we could do some carbon dating of the wood if there's anything in mortise and tenon joins that could be accessible. Note here the chiseling and how the text has been applied over that chiseling. So there is a removal of expensive commodities and then a reapplication of a name in a pious manner as a caretaker, naming the king, but only burying him in one coffin. All of these kings must have been buried in triple nesting sets at least. Tutankhamun was buried in 9 layers of protection, including the shrines. So we have to assume that these kings were also originally buried in such nesting sets. When the caretakers came in and cached them at the final moment, they only had one coffin in which to be buried. The locks are broken on this 18th dynasty coffin, and that's what's circled here. And here's the image that helps me to understand that this coffin was opened and closed, that multiple times. And you can see it here. Let me zoom in on the mortise and tenon joints, where and this is something that Darcy sometimes noted in his book and sometimes didn't. But I can really work with. Thutmose III's coffin is the one where we really want to focus on that. And I've talked about that in other talks as well. But you can see that this bottom mortise and tenon joint has been sawn through. So the coffin was consecrated, ritually activated, the body's inside, but there's a cultural memory that there are riches inside that could be used to create income. So somebody important with access to this king's tomb carefully saws through it, pulls out whatever they want from the inside of this coffin. Maybe he was buried with a golden mask. Maybe he was buried with precious amulets. Maybe, and I would suggest, the interior had some sort of gilding because it seems to have been cut back. This mortise is farther to the left, as you can see on the case side, and the case side gets thinner and thinner and thinner, according to the mortise and tenons. When they remove whatever it is they want to remove from the interior, they then sink a new mortise and tenon joint, and you can see that here. So these are the kinds of details that we are able to see when we open up a coffin, and a particular coffin, and then you're like, okay, these mummies are being used in the 20th and 21st dynasties as ways of showing that they should have power, that they're caretaking for the kings at the same time that they're systematically going through over the generations, over hundreds of years, to remove more and more from these kings' coffins. We talked a little bit about the coffin of Thutmose I, in which Penejim I was reburied, but what a beautiful statement of quid pro quo to say, I take from you, King Thutmose I, but I rebury you in a coffin as is fitting for you. I reosirify you, I reconsecrate you, and as such, you then give to me your coffin material, and I am now as you are, and he can be named as a king, this high priest of Amen, Penejim I, in the coffin of Thutmose I. It is an interesting thing to me that he covers over the old Penejim I decoration. You can see the stripes of the old headdress of the 18th dynasty here, and yet he covers it with something that is almost exactly the same. He covers it with the same kinds of stripes, and he has it regilded. That gilded is removed by later agents post Penejim I, probably around the reign of Penejim II, or even into the 22nd dynasty. This is an extraordinary thing for me here. Look at these hands. At some point, maybe when Penejim I was reusing it, they were removing gold from this coffin. It could be gold sheeting, it could be gilding, we don't know. But they removed it in a manner that was so rough that the hands had big gouges taken out of it. And then to reuse it for Thutmose I, this is carefully repaired. And you can see that there are pieces of wood placed into these hands where the gouging was made. And then this was plastered over and gilded for Penejim I. Then maybe Penejim II time or into the 22nd dynasty, all of that gilding was removed so that I could come in a couple thousand years and look at this and say, how interesting, we have multiple layers of reuse happening on this particular coffin set. Here's the name of Thutmose I that is covered over with plaster. And how interesting that Thutmose I's agents, his lieutenants, his close inner circle would have absolutely known that this was a king's coffin and that he was being buried in a king's coffin, a reused king's coffin. And those agents of the king would have understood that royal coffin granted him a royal power. But then when he's displaying it to a larger audience, an audience of more Thebans, maybe with some lower elites and other people who aren't a part of his inner circle, he hides the fact that he's buried in a reused king's coffin. He doesn't advertise this fact. He makes it something that his inner circle would know, but other people would not know. And so you can look at these coffins and understand how these leaders are communicating to different audiences with different messages. One group gets a certain message and another group gets a different message. I think we see this in our political landscape as well. Now, it's almost time for me to wrap up. So I am going to scroll through images from the book so you get an idea of what the book is like, how it's laid out, what it looks like. You get some sawn through tenons for the coffin of Thutmose I and the first, which implies that maybe they sawed through it even when it was Penejim's coffin thereafter. But let's get to Thutmose III, and I want to focus on the interior of this. This is the Darcy image. It's a wonderful study of the coffin. Darcy was very careful with what he was looking at. But we didn't know the extent of the reuse of the Theban necropolises at this point. So he wasn't looking at it from this perspective. This is how we stand on the shoulders of giants, and we all do our work communally. But this coffin in which Thutmose III was reburied was made for a king. Whether it was made for Thutmose III or not is arguable because it has been completely reworked inside and out. You can see that the gilding which was applied in a very thin layer, and that there are multiple layers of gilding added to this coffin. So Thutmose III was treated like his mummy and his divinized self was treated, I would argue, as a kind of statue icon, as an image of the divinity. that was probably held aloft in some rituals in temple activity. I cannot prove this, but the fact that it's gilded and then some gilding is removed and then it's re-gilded with a thin layer of gilding, probably after gold sheeting of the 18th dynasty was removed the first time, is evocative of using and reusing this king to manufacture power in the 20th, 21st, and less in the early 22nd dynasty, which is when this final act of chiseling would have happened, this brutal removal of all of the gold at the end. Note that this coffin once had two uraei, and the uraeus that is preserved is off center. There's a lot of discussion of the uraei. I would refer you to the work of Nicholas Brown, who published on this coffin and talks about this double uraeus, similar to what you see in Tutankhamun's coffin set and similar to what you see on the canopic jars of Horemheb that survive. And it's interesting that the other hole is plastered over. For whatever reason, this double cobra and vulture uraeus becomes passé, not fashionable, not appropriate for some reason. And we go to a single uraeus. You also see this on the coffin in which Ramses II was reburied. But this is where I want to stop, and then I'll scroll through all kinds of things and make you all mad and go to the thank you slide and where you can get more information. But this is an extraordinary thing. These are my notes in the field. This is me with my iPad, taking pictures, putting them side by side and circling things and going, oh my gods, look at how they've actually opened and closed this thing multiple times. And you have mortise and tenon joins that show that the width of the coffin was once much more structurally stable, similar to Tutankhamun's coffin. And as more precious material from the interior was removed, the mortise and tenons moved over to the interior for an ever thinner coffin side, which means that the interior of this coffin, which is decorated for Thutmose III in an archaizing 18th dynasty style way, was almost certainly not done in the 18th dynasty. It was applied in the 21st dynasty. It has to be stratigraphically. There's nothing else that it could actually be. So we see the use of these coffins and of the mummy entities inside them to talismanically grant power. Note how the kinds of things I look at. You can see an element of gilding there preserved on the right, which suggests that the interior and the seams were re-gilded in the 21st dynasty and then removed. You can see they're cutting through that plaster to remove that gilding in the image on the left. Coffin of Ramses II, we're going to have to skip, but I do want to show one tiny little, well, here, look at the redone uraeus. Probably was double. Somebody x-ray this, please. It's in the Nemec. Those of you who work there, please x-ray and see if there's a double hole here. But that's what I suspected is just from my visual analysis. And you can see that it was redone to be a single uraeus for Ramses II. We include de-stretched photographs, so you can see some of the old dockets underneath the dockets that you can currently see. And here's the thing I want to focus on. This is a cedar coffin. And Nicholas Reeves has already argued very convincingly that this is a late 18th dynasty coffin reused for Ramses II. And the kind of work that I do shows that we have a mortise and tenon joint right here that has been exposed, which means that this coffin had sides that were probably that much thicker than they are now. So gold sheeting was probably removed. Inlay takes a lot of space. You cut it into the wood. Why else would you have that mortise and tenon hanging on unless you're cutting off a significant chunk of the coffin's surface because there was this amount of inlay like you see on Tutankhamun's coffin preserved today. And that arrow there is pointing out where that mortise and tenon is hanging off and preserved. And this is a wonderful comparison, right? The gilded wooden coffin of Tutankhamun, and you get an idea of the thickness of the case sides in comparison to this one. And the outer coffin, as we will soon see in the gem, inshallah, is a wonderful comparison as well. I can't wait to get an up and close examination. I already showed this. I should have cut that. And these, we don't have time for it all. Everyone close your eyes as I go through. And here. These are the kings who are included in Theban tomb 320. These are the ancestor kings whom the high priests of Amun are really connecting to, focusing on, often showing on their own coffins in the 20th and 21st and early 22nd dynasties. And the other kings are those that are considered problematic politically in some way. I argue. And so you can read this argument in Recycling for Death. Now, I'm not talking about the high priest coffins at all. So you will have to bear with me as I go through and show you how they are all reused. 100% of them are reused. Look at how Masaharta's outer coffin is cut back from ostensibly an 18th dynasty piece. And you can only see that clearly from the back. Inner coffin of Mat Kaure, look at the multiple plaster layers that are there, at least 3, which suggests reuse. Nessie Konsu's is, she's reusing this coffin with just a simple name reuse of another woman. And you can see that name reuse very easily here. It was probably visible for everyone in the audience to see as well. And all of this reuse creates so much anxiety amongst the people who are doing it that the later 21st, early 22nd dynasty high priest coffins that are preserved in the Royal Cache, they completely cover with this black material of bitumen, resins, and a cooked down sort of black varnish. And they paint it over the whole coffin, kind of like giving a bank robber purple paint with the cash that they steal, so that whoever tried to steal from this coffin would be covered with this tacky black substance. And yeah, it's a really interesting defensive strategy, trying to get people to not take from the coffin. So I stop it there. You can learn more about the book here. You can get more information about AUC Press, and you can learn more about my podcast, Afterlives of Ancient Egypt, and a lot of other information. So go ahead and do that QR code for all of the stuff that I'm doing. And thank you all. Thank you all for listening.
We have received so many questions in the Q&A, so I'm just going to read some of them, okay?
Yeah.
So Isabel Plante, she asked, how does the quality of the reuse differ between people appropriating another's coffin, perhaps within the same family or not, versus reuse for royal reburials by the priesthood, for example, the royal mummy caches?
Yeah, this is its own study, really, what you're asking. And it's a study that I am working on in the second volume that I will co-author with Kylie Thompson. Comparisons between how one reused for royalty and how one reused in a private context. It is an interesting thing that in at least one case, and that would be the coffin in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the coffin set of Ta Bechnet Naouni, that the Book of the Dead tells us they were related. And the name of Ta Bechnet, the mother, is retained on the coffin that is reused for Naouni. And one wonders if in a family context, it was considered appropriate to keep the name of the beloved relative on the coffin, whereas in other contexts, it might not have been appropriate. So those kinds of questions need to be asked and answered as best we can. But we're talking about an elites game. These are elite coffins, and the reuse is driven by the elites. Yes, the tomb robbery papyri indicate that poorer people are creating income for themselves as well, but the crackdown on them would have been harder. In the same way today that you can be a banker and steal all kinds of money from people and never go to jail. But if you steal one small thing from a shop, you could be in jail for the rest of your life. This is the unfair society that we live in. The Egyptians lived in the same unfair society.
Been ongoing for 7,000 years.
Yeah.
Okay, and Dalia Rajdan is also asking, when the coffin is reused, what happens to the mummy that was previously buried in there?
Yeah, it's the best question. And I think my answer for that would be to look for the publication of Theban Tomb 1 or look at KV 35. There are many circumstances in which excavators go into a tomb and they see in Theban Tomb 1 at Deir el-Medina, there are 22 bodies, but only 9 of them were buried in coffins. And when I published my book, The Cost of Death, I assumed that the people who didn't have coffins were buried originally without coffins, that they were sharing the material wealth from their richer relatives. I don't think that anymore. I think that all of those people originally had coffin sets, and that as the 20th dynasty progressed, the family members would remove the ancestors, the ones who were least important, the ones who were least remembered first, and they were carefully put to the side and almost certainly given magical treatment, magical spells to make sure that they didn't do anything difficult to the dead. I'm sorry, to the living, so they didn't become angry dead or something like that. And then they were maintained in the burial chamber alongside. And you can go into or look at publications of tombs that are found intact or semi-intact, and you'll see some bodies in coffins and then other bodies not in coffins. This is a very you'll see it in Winlock publications. You'll see it in that Theban tomb one I mentioned, or the tomb of Amenhotep II, and on and on. Yeah.
Yeah, there's another question that I personally have the same question. So Inji is asking, I just want to know how they put kings in a very high sacred place, but they end up reusing coffins, especially as I know that religion was a huge deal for ancient Egyptians. How can they justify that in terms of religion?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think that we assume that religion rules people completely. And I always argue that religion is created socially. Religion it starts with socioeconomics. It starts with how religion as an institution is often there to create a structure so that a very few elites can monopolize violence, like a smiting motif, can monopolize economic wealth, like the gold and electrum that is covering temples, or look at the Vatican. And can monopolize political power. So religion is a tool that is serving the political, economic, military needs of an elite. And religion can be turned and used to serve that elite in the same way. And people at a time period of discord and social upheaval are not going to be so slavish to a religion that they do everything that it says. They're going to adapt it and change it and use it and say, we're the high priests. We're rescuing these kings from the degradations of the tomb robbers. We have to do this, in a sense. People are very good at justifying the kinds of things that they do. And that justification, it uses religion as well. I would encourage you to look to the Oracle for Nessie Khonsu. It's published in Robert Rittner's Libyan Anarchy book. And you have there a ritual hymn, one of the most complete hymns we have for Amun-Re. Beautiful hymn to Amun-Re. And then this deification of Nessie Khonsu, in which she is said to have her heart encircled, and she is deified and made into a god. But it also says very explicitly so that you won't hurt or harm anyone else. And I find it a very interesting thing that the religion it can be used to cleanse, it can be used to absolve, it can be used to create power. But it's used to create power for those at the top of society, while those at the top of society are using that same religion to get people to do what they think is appropriate to serve them. Remember, morality is a construct. These ideas of what is good and what is bad. It's and I'm not saying there is no morality in the world. Don't go there. But I am saying that it serves those elites. So when I work with religion, I work with it from a socioeconomic perspective first, and then go towards the religious. But it's a wonderful question. And one final thing, and I'm so sorry, is to take a religious ideological tack. If your ancestor, like say a beloved mother or father, has died at a time period when you can't get access to wood to make her a coffin, then it would be religiously and morally appropriate for you to go into your burial chamber, take a coffin set from an ancestor who has already been transformed, move them to the side, magically make sure they are encircled and protected, pull that coffin out, and replaster it and repaint it for your beloved ancestor who has yet to be transformed. So from a moral perspective, reuse also works. It's something that people felt they needed to do in a time of crisis. But the anxiety was real. Look at a text like Khonsu Emhab and the Ghost from this 20th dynasty time period. People were very worried about what it meant that that coffins were being taken away from powerful ancestors. And these high priests of Amen were worried about it as well.
Yeah. Interesting. Jaw from Sweden is asking, if wood was a scarce resource, how come they don't take the coffin wood itself and repurpose it for other purposes and bury the king as it is, like the same case with Muslims nowadays who don't use coffins and they just bury their dead in white sheet?
So for the latter point, I do ask this question. What an interesting thing that at a time period when coffin wood is practically unavailable, and that for the Royal Cache, I see 100% reuse for the 21st dynasty high priests of Amen and their family members. Why do they not turn towards a religious understanding that doesn't need coffin materiality at all? And people change slowly. They don't change if they don't have to. If there's enough material wealth for them to create the coffin display that they need to socially separate, and there seems to have been, then they don't change. It's interesting, as you move into the 22nd dynasty, you see the reliance on more papier-mâché, cartonnage, as we call it, a wood substitute, if you like. So instead of getting rid of the coffin, getting rid of the wood, you instead see elites saying, okay, how can we make wood? Let's manufacture some wood. In the same way that blue glass was a manufacturer of lapis lazuli. You can't get lapis lazuli, let's make some blue glass, right? That's what Tutankhamun's mask is. It's not lapis in most places except the beard and other elements. Most of it is glass. So there are workarounds. And what was the other part of the question?
Why not just cover them in sheets and just use the wood for something else?
Oh, but there was so it's, I mean, the short answer is elites got so much out of the divinization of their family dead. It served them to reuse rather than leave all of that wealth in the tombs. And then I remember now what it was. The questioner was asking, did they use coffins for other things? And I do suggest that they do in chapter 2 of this book. There is evidence in the late Ramesside letters for making weapons out of wood and bronze. And they're asking Deir el-Medina workers to collect bronze and wood. Where else are they getting this? I suggest, but the necropolis, rather than getting bronze from some sort of directly from a smelting source. It seems they're getting bronze from vessels left in tombs, melting those down and using those to make spear points. And they're getting wood for the spear shafts, I suggest, from tombs as well. Think of the coffin set of Yuya and Tuya and how much wood there is in a coffin like that, and what you could build in terms of weaponry at a time of social discord. I do think that was one way these coffins were reused as well. And how fitting then that as you go from the 18th to the 19th to the 20th dynasties, coffins get smaller. 18th dynasty coffin wood can be this thick or thicker, right? For a Yuya and Tuya outer coffin, it's insane how much wood they're actually able to use, and conspicuous consumption is there for everyone to see. As you go into the 21st and 22nd dynasties, a coffin case side is this wide, and the coffin is much smaller in its proportions. So you see an interest in saving as much wood as you possibly can, and more of a standardized coffin set that is smaller in its proportions.
Okay, another question from Marion. I hope I'm pronouncing correctly her name, or his name, not sure. Do we know anything about reuse of coffins in earlier and or later periods? And if yes, do you have any suggestions or for articles or books to read about this?
There's coffin reuse happening in any intermediate period. And I started with this material because of my book, The Cost of Death, which I was interested in how art, as we might call it in the Western world, how craft was priced. And I wanted to know how elites competed with one another with their purchases. And that's why I started with the Ramesside period and then went on into the 21st dynasty. But I think there is evidence for coffin reuse in every time period of social upheaval, and sometimes not even extraordinary social upheaval. It could be even in a time of centralization. And this is the work that all of you get to do. So go forth and look at these objects in a a very meticulous, close way. You'll be amazed what kinds of information you can get by staring at an object for a couple of hours and taking careful notes and looking at another object of the same type and another and another. And you start to create a new way of looking at a piece, and you start to build patterns that you didn't think that you could actually see before. So I don't have any books to suggest for Old Kingdom or Middle Kingdom coffin reuse or late period coffin reuse, but I know the work is being done, so that you can, it's out there, and a lot of it is in process right now. Yeah,
I mean, every day we learn something new. I mean,
we do. Yeah.
El Sayed Al Aswad is asking a question more about the souls. So, have you ever thought of the bas or souls of the different dead persons occupying a reused coffins? Do they get lost? Do they find their way?
I mean, this is something the Egyptians had anxiety about as well. You can see it. They don't talk about it directly. It's a very ancient Egyptian, and I dare say modern Egyptian thing, to not talk about the difficult thing directly, that you talk around it. But to bring up one text, I think it's Ostrakhan Louvre 698, if I remember the number correctly, but it's the letter of Butek Amen to his dead wife. And he directs this letter. It's like when you write a letter, you're like, hey, mom, how are you? I'm doing great. Or, dear love, how are you doing? He doesn't say it directly to her. He addresses it to her coffin. And he addresses it to the afdet. It's an archaic word for a coffin, to the chest of his wife. And that's an extraordinary thing, that the material that it has been transformed into the divinized version of the deceased is there the container that the dead can then connect with and can talk to. And Butek Amen felt that connecting with the material was a better magical tool for reaching out to the dead loved one. Once you know that, it creates a lot of anxiety, right? Think of Consuemhab and the ghost. This guy is being haunted by a Middle Kingdom elite dude who is like, I'm going to keep haunting you, and I'm upset, and I'm wandering and lost in the in-between lands. And the only way the high priest can solve it is by making him a very wealthy, very lovely, very embellished coffin set and reburying the ancestor in that coffin set, and then his soul rests. So there is an anxiety amongst Theban elites who can write these texts down, and almost certainly others who are asking themselves, where does the soul of the dead go? Do we need all this material to transform and contain the dead? I'm sure that this time period of social crisis was also a time where people searched their own souls to ask, do we need all of this stuff for the dead to exist in the way that we want them to? When I reuse the coffin of my mother, I need to keep the name of my mother on the coffin. We're talking about Tabechnet Nauni, and I'm sure there are other examples that we haven't seen. That's a way of maintaining a connection with the dead in the afterlife. There's a coffin text that's a spell for finding your loved ones in the afterlife. These are the kinds of things that normal people are worried about, whether they're rich or not. But we have to remember that it's only the rich who have this option of a kind of divinized material forever burial. And that forever burial is exactly what is damaged at this moment. You get the transformation, you get the manifestation into a divinity, even if you're using the coffin for a very short period of time, but you don't get that forever ownership. And I'm sure it was a quandary for many people, something that they thought about. And it's something I don't have a direct answer to, frustratingly. Yeah.
Greg is asking, why do you think the coffin from KV55 Echnaten was not stripped and reused?
I think that there were different moments of stripping and reusing these pieces. I think most of the material from the Amarna tomb was stripped and reused, and certain elements were then, to encase the body of the king, put aside in a different holding place. And then a lot of the KV555 material may have been forgotten or They got what they needed out of it. And then by the early 22nd dynasty, people didn't quite remember that it was there. This is the kind of research that other people need to do in terms of because I looked at this a little, but there's so much work one could do on the timelines of when these things actually happen. And Nick Reeves is the one who's done the most work thus far, but this tomb is opened at this time. And this high priest of Amun goes in and takes out these burials. And then these tombs are open at another time. What happens with the later 18th dynasty kings? It's been suggested by Nick that there was a different cache for I and Horemheb and all of these other guys that in the tomb of Horemheb that has since been completely looted and is gone. And that there was no interest in the 22nd dynasty of even caching or putting these things away in any way, shape, or form. It's amazing we actually have what's left of the king's bodies and coffins in the tomb of Amenhotep II, really. Because TT 320 or Dir al-Bahri 320 was carefully hidden in a place that, and there's disagreement here. The Spanish team suggests that in the 21st dynasty that it was a place that wasn't hidden. It was a place that was openly revered. But I think when they're all cached away in the 22nd dynasty, it's a time when they're not interested in this 18th dynasty connection with the ancestors, and they want these things out of sight and out of mind. I know I didn't give you an answer that is appropriate, but the work still needs to be done on that one. So go forth and do it. Yeah.
Okay, I mean, we have still a couple of questions, so maybe one last question before we wrap this up, if that's okay. Keith is asking, was the development of cartonnage a response to the scarcity of wood and its expense? I think we kind of...
I think the Egyptians aren't going to tell us that. There's no we invented cartonnage because we couldn't get wood. But it is an interesting thing. And this isn't the first time cartonnage is developed, right? Cartonnage has been used before. And there's a lot of 21st dynasty cartonnage. There's a topic that hasn't really been covered yet. There's 21st dynasty cartonnage that aren't preserved in Bab el-Ghazus or TT 320 that needs to be looked at more as well, because it makes sense that in a time period of wood scarcity you would have more cartonnage reliance. This fake wood that you're creating. Cartonnage also demands a lot of energy. It demands the creation of plaster, and you've got to heat things up to create that plaster, and that would have needed charcoal arguably, but that's again research for other people. I think cartonnage studies are in terms of material expense and production, I think we need more work on that for certain.
Okay, I'm gonna read aloud a comment that we received that I find very touching. Brian Smith said, it's not a question, it's a comment, and he says, I do admire how you talk to the mummified remains as a gesture of respect in light of your scientific approach, never forgetting that they were once living human beings. And I think it's very important to kind of then forget that. So I just want to say thank you so much, Cara, for taking the time of your day to enlighten us with this talk and webinar. I mean, we've had a steady number of people attending, glued to their screens, and I'm seeing so many positive comments from our attendees. So I'm sure they feel the same. I've learned so much. I've always seen these coffins in the Egyptian Museum. I never thought, oh, somebody else used it before that. So thank you so much for enlightening us and giving us the time and answering the questions. And if you would like to say a few words before we wrap up, you have the floor now.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm looking at all of the comments of thanks and thank you all for attending and for your interest in the topic. And it's complicated stuff, and I'm thrilled that everyone's interested in this academic material. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and this is again a reminder that you can order your copy of Recycling for Death from online book retailers and booksellers worldwide, and soon to be available in Egypt. So, but it's available for pre-order through AUC bookstores. I put the links in the chat box and also on our Facebook page. But whoever attended our lecture is going to get also links to the recording of this session, so you could go back and watch it as much as you want, and you're also going to receive links to buy the book. Again, thank you so much, Kara. Thank you, everyone who joined us from all over the world. It's always a pleasure. And see you in our next virtual talk.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good day. Take care.